In this lesson, we'll cover the MV's ability to control other AV devices in your system, including AVRs and displays. This adds a great deal of control, simplifying the integration and use of your system. For instance, the MV can automatically apply a profile when a particular HDMI input is selected in your AVR. It can also overlay a volume bar when your volume is adjusted. This is particularly handy for AVRs that don't offer an on-screen volume indicator or for users that prefer a different look for this overlay. Additionally, the MV's volume bar appears within the content, unlike many AVRs that place it below the content, thus preventing any issues with triggering aspect ratio changes during the movie when changing the volume. Likewise, when it comes to displays, the MV can direct your display to automatically switch picture modes when playing HDR versus SDR content, as well as turn the display on and off. Let's take a look at how device control is implemented. Here we are on the device IP control configuration menu. Note it's highly recommended that your network is configured to use DHCP reservations for these devices, including the MV, so that they all have static IP addresses. Likewise, many devices require that you are not using their eco option and that the device is in standby mode when not in use. To begin, choose the network search under Find Devices. After a few moments, it will return the AVRs and displays it finds in your network. Let's give that a try. Okay, let's have a look at the detected devices, starting with the AVRs. First, you can see it found 3 AVRs, a Lindorf MP60, a Trinov Altitude, and Storm ISP. For demonstration purposes, we'll select the Storm. Upon doing so, we're presented with the options to control the AVR. Let's explore these. The power on and power off options can be used to have the MV turn on and off your devices as the MV powers on and off. This is handy if you want to control the order that your gear is turned on in. For instance, you might find that things work best if the display powers on after the MV. You can also control how long to wait before the MV turns on your devices. Okay, now let's look at the audio volume on-screen display option. By default, this is on for AVRs that do not offer an overlaid on-screen volume bar and off otherwise. You can still turn it on even for AVRs that overlay the volume. However, you may want to then turn off the AVR's volume display if it supports that ability. When this feature is turned on, the MV will display a volume bar and mute indicator that updates as you change these settings in your AVR, or even when using the MV remote to control your AVR, which we'll touch on shortly. I'll demonstrate this feature now by first turning it on and then lowering and raising the volume. Next, I'll mute and then unmute the AVR. As you can see, this feature is especially nice if your AVR has no on-screen volume display or if you prefer the look of the MV's volume bar over that of your AVR. Moving along, we have the default polling rate of 200 milliseconds. This should be sufficient, but you can lower it if the response time of the on-screen display lags a bit. Let's also look at the input source device option. This will reflect the current HDMI input selected in the AVR. In this case, it's HDMI 5. If we want the MV to recall certain settings, particularly for this device, we can simply assign this input to a source profile. For example, let's assign this input to our Kaleidoscape source profile. Now, whenever HDMI 5 is selected on the AVR, it will automatically recall the Kaleidoscape source profile and apply its settings. Note that there isn't an option to list and assign all HDMI inputs at the same time. Instead, select the HDMI input for your AVR for the source you want to assign. This menu will then update to show the newly selected HDMI input. For instance, I'll change the AVR to input 2, which is connected to an Apple TV. Notice that the menu now shows input 2 instead of input 5. Now that it's switched, I can assign this to the Apple TV source. Notice also that once a source profile is assigned to your AVR, like we just demonstrated, the envy will change the AVR to that input whenever the source profile is selected in the envy. For instance, watch as I select the Kaleidoscape source profile. When I did this, the envy directed the AVR to switch to the Kaleidoscape input, and any settings assigned to that profile will be automatically loaded. For further convenience, upon assigning your AVR in this menu, the up and down arrow keys on your envy remote control can be used to change the AVR volume. You can press and hold the OK button for 1 second to toggle mute as well. You can change this functionality in the envy remote control configuration menu, which we covered in great detail in a previous lesson, by choosing different actions for the up and down arrow keys and the OK hold key. Furthermore, if you assign source profiles in the envy to match your AVR inputs as discussed, you can then assign left and right arrow keys to the cycle profile group action and can then cycle through your AVR HDMI inputs using the left and right arrow keys. You can take things a step further and assign buttons on the envy remote using the Activate Profile command to activate the source device profiles. Then you can switch HDMI inputs on your AVR simply by using the colored buttons on the envy remote. Again, for more information on how to configure the envy remote, see the lesson on this topic. Since many envy customers, particularly enthusiasts, tend to keep the envy remote at arm's reach, the ability to control the AVR with the envy remote can be very convenient, even if primarily using a learning remote or control system. Next, let's look at the flexibility that the envy's IP control can add to your system for seamlessly controlling your display. I'll start by looking at what display the envy has found on the network. In this case, you can see the envy has found a JVC display. Let's take a look at the flexibility this provides. If your display requires a password for IP control, as in the case with the JVC, you will be prompted for the password like you see here before it presents the IP control options. Enter the password which matches the password set in the display. You can usually find or set your display's password in the network options on your display. Now that we entered the password, the settings to control the display are now available. The options to turn the display on and off with the envy are available and work the same as with the AVR. Next, let's look at the options to recall different picture modes in the display when watching HDR versus SDR content and the flexibility this provides. For example, let's assume for HDR you want to use the highest laser output fully open iris, and for SDR you want to use a lower laser output with a fully closed iris. We can then set up user 1 and user 2 picture mode settings in the display, for example, to use these preferred settings for HDR and SDR accordingly. Then we simply choose these picture modes in our settings from the submenu for HDR and SDR. The envy will then direct the display to switch between these picture modes automatically when the content switches between HDR and SDR. Let's have a look at the HDR picture modes. The options shown here match the presets available in this JVC. Note that if you rename the user presets, you will continue to see the generic user names such as user 1 and user 2 instead of the custom names. In the case of the JVC, you can see an active tag in the menu which indicates which profile is active on the JVC. However, this tag is only shown if your JVC is powered on when configuring this setting. Also note that the envy does not immediately switch the active picture mode when you select a new mode in the envy menu. It only switches the next time the input signal switches between SDR and HDR, or when you restart the envy. Therefore, you may notice that you can cycle through the options in the envy menu and the active tag will not change till the next time the input signal switches. This is intentional so that when configuring these options, The user will not accidentally cycle through the picture modes and then forget which picture mode their JVC was originally using. Lastly, should you ever wish to remove any found devices from the menu which are not currently assigned, highlight the Find Devices option and press the yellow button. If you wish to remove all devices, be sure to set the selected devices to None Selected and save this setting to the base layer before using the cleanup option. Let's do this now. As you can see, the Envy's ability to control and respond to the AVR and display is quite powerful. It's very useful if you're not using a control system or if you're using an AVR that does not overlay a volume bar. And the ease of use and simplified integration can be very attractive even for those who are using a control system. Okay, now that we covered how to control other AV devices with the Envy, it's time to move on to our next lesson.